Trump publicly insulted the leadership of Canada. Buffett emphasized that what occurred in those 26 minutes may have damaged United States-Canada relations more than decades of tariff disputes combined. What can happen in 26 minutes that unsettles trust built over decades? This was not simply a meeting cut short. It was about confidence, about alliances, about long-term costs the market ultimately absorbs. When a session scheduled for 90 minutes ends after only 26 minutes, that alone is a signal. The Canadian delegation entered the White House expecting a genuine trade negotiation, structured, conducted in good faith, grounded in mutual respect between allied nations. They left after 26 minutes with the sense that what occurred in that room may leave a fracture difficult to repair. According to multiple sources, present accounts from both sides were largely consistent. A routine diplomatic exchange quickly became the sharpest confrontation in modern history between United States and Canadian officials. Voices were raised. Demands were made that the Canadian side described as unprecedented and humiliating. The atmosphere shifted, and when the atmosphere shifts, markets eventually register it. There was a specific moment, a statement, a demand delivered with a tone of contempt unseen in decades of international diplomacy. The senior Canadian official paused, closed his folder, pushed back his chair, and walked toward the door. The meeting ended there. I was informed of the details only hours later from multiple sources. My response was not about politics. It was about the underlying economic mechanism. You cannot resolve trade disputes by humiliating the other party in a room, Buffett said. You cannot negotiate by demanding submission. What you do is create an enemy. And America just created an enemy. It cannot afford. What happened in 26 minutes inside the White House did more damage to United States-Canada relations than decades of trade disagreements, tariff disputes, and diplomatic friction combined, because policy disputes can be negotiated. Tariff rates can be adjusted, market access terms can be restructured, but personal humiliation cannot be erased. Tariff rates can be adjusted, terms can be restructured. Even policy disputes can be renegotiated over time. But personal humiliation remains in memory. It shapes how parties approach the table the next time. In international economics, trust is a form of intangible capital. When it erodes, the real cost of capital rises in ways not always immediately visible. What occurred in the Roosevelt room of the White House will be recounted for years, not because of technical tariff details, but because of how it unfolded. When one hears the full language used, the demands presented, and the precise moment everything broke down, it becomes clear why diplomats on both sides of the border call this a point of no return. That meeting was not an isolated event. It was the result of weeks of escalating tension. The trade war had extended for months. Tariffs were imposed and then retaliated. Public rhetoric grew increasingly sharp. Trump publicly insulted the leadership of Canada. Canada responded with statements of its own that became progressively more direct. Meanwhile, cross-border supply chains began to feel strain. Markets experienced volatility and recorded losses. Workers at automobile plants in Michigan and manufacturing facilities in Ontario lost shifts and hours. And when working people lose confidence that those in charge have a clear plan, the impact does not remain on balance sheets. It spreads in ways we have observed across many prior cycles. And here is what is worth considering. When allies begin intervening to prevent further damage, the question is no longer who is right, but how much trust remains. International allies, European leaders, Group of 7 partners, and North Atlantic Treaty Organization officials applied public and private pressure on both governments to return to the table before the damage became irreversible. The meeting was announced as an opportunity to reset the framework. Both sides issued cautiously optimistic statements about common ground and rebuilding the trade structure that had served the two nations for decades. The White House described it as a chance to recalibrate direction. Ottawa called it an opportunity for genuine good faith negotiation on issues central to both nations. Markets responded with a modest uptick. Business leaders expressed restrained relief. For a brief moment, the world allowed itself to believe that responsible adults might regain control of a situation that had drifted too far. The Canadian delegation prepared for weeks, not merely days. Senior trade negotiators, economic advisors, and policy specialists assembled the most comprehensive bilateral trade proposal Canada had ever presented. The document extended hundreds of pages. It included specific concessions on agricultural market access, addressing areas the United States had long viewed as legitimate grievances and where Ottawa was prepared to show flexibility. The proposal also outlined detailed frameworks for energy, trade reform, manufacturing integration, and cross-border investment. Economic models were constructed to quantify in dollar terms the shared benefits of de-escalation. The entire structure was built around a single strategic priority: provide the United States with sufficient tangible policy gains to declare a victory, give Mr. Chroniclaw, Trump the substance of a win so symbolic dominance would not be necessary. The Canadian team understood clearly who they were negotiating with, and they shaped their approach accordingly. Their objective was not to win an argument. It was to create conditions under which the other side could agree without losing face. The delegation was led by Canada's highest-ranking trade official, joined by economists, legal advisors, and the Prime Minister's most trusted policy aides. They carried neatly organized binders labeled and color-coded. Data were prepared on laptops with presentation slides ready for every scenario. They brought 14 distinct compromise frameworks covering every major point of disagreement. They arrived in Washington the evening before. At the Canadian Embassy, they reviewed each negotiation pathway well past midnight. The following morning, they entered the White House with something markets consistently value but cannot precisely price. It was genuine good faith. According to sources close to the United States side, the level of preparation differed significantly. Trump did not review the Canadian proposals, though they had been delivered 4 days earlier through diplomatic channels. There was no substantive preparatory session examining what a realistic agreement might look like or what long-term United States priorities should be. On the morning of the meeting, he spent 30 minutes with senior communications advisors. The focus was not trade substance, but presentation. How to ensure the meeting projected American strength. How to guarantee that any message emerging would appear as a victory for the administration, regardless of what actually occurred inside the room. One source stated plainly that the approach was not designed to secure an agreement, but to produce a brief segment of footage. The meeting took place in the Roosevelt Room of the White House, a rectangular conference room adjacent to the Oval Office with a long mahogany table seating approximately 20 people. Portraits of Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt hung on opposing walls. The deliberate formality served as a reminder that decisions made in that space often carry consequences beyond the immediate moment. The Canadian delegation sat along one side of the table. The American delegation sat opposite. Flags stood behind each side, the stars and stripes beside the maple leaf arranged as they had been in thousands of meetings across 75 years of alliance. Water glasses were placed at every seat and largely untouched. Notebooks lay open, pens carefully positioned. Every physical detail of the room reflected the care of those who understand that the setting of a negotiation conveys respect and seriousness. In the Roosevelt Room, everything was positioned for diplomatic purpose, and that itself forms part of the structure of trust upon which markets quietly rely over time. And then when everything had been arranged in its proper ceremonial order, the real question was no longer the substance of the proposal, but whether the two sides were engaged in the same conversation. When structure is ready, but intentions are misaligned, long-term costs often begin forming inside the room itself. Everything had been prepared for a serious exchange between partners expected to resolve difficult issues. But that is not how it unfolded. The meeting opened according to established custom. The press was permitted inside for the first few minutes. Cameras, microphones, and familiar diplomatic rituals were fully observed. Trump welcomed the Canadian delegation with brief public remarks. He spoke of hopes for a tremendous agreement, very large, very good, beneficial to both nations. The Canadian leader responded with measured language, referencing shared interests, mutual respect, and the importance of the bilateral relationship. Handshakes were exchanged, photographs were taken, professional smiles appeared beneath the camera lights. Then the reporters were asked to leave. The heavy door of the Roosevelt Room closed. According to all sources present, the atmosphere shifted almost immediately. The change was so noticeable, some compared it to a sudden drop in temperature. The Canadian delegation began its presentation. The chief trade negotiator, a professional diplomat, with more than 20 years of experience in international commerce, spoke in a structured and deliberate manner. He began with areas of greatest concern to the American side: agricultural market access, energy pricing structures, manufacturing protections. The presentation was detailed and professional. designed to demonstrate that Canada had heard American grievances and was prepared to address them through meaningful concessions. It was the kind of good faith opening that typically lays the foundation for effective negotiation. Within 3 minutes, Mr. Trump began showing visible disinterest. He leaned back in his chair. He glanced at his watch without attempting to conceal the gesture. He picked up his phone and looked at the screen while the Canadian negotiator was still speaking. When the Canadian side paused to emphasize a specific data point, Trump interrupted with a question about Canadian dairy subsidies. It was a legitimate trade issue, but it was not on the agenda that day. It was not part of the proposal under discussion, and it was delivered with impatience rather than inquiry. The interruption forced the Canadian side to halt and redirect. It was the first fracture, and according to multiple sources, it was not accidental. Trump then assumed control of the conversation. Instead of addressing specific elements within the proposal, he began an extended monologue. Sources describe this portion as lasting approximately 8 minutes. Without interruption, the content wandered increasingly far from the meeting's central purpose. He spoke about the strength of the American economy, about how every nation seeks access to the United States market, about how Canada needs America far more than the reverse. He cited trade deficit figures. Some were approximate, some were significantly exaggerated. None came from the briefing materials prepared by his own team. He referenced prior Canadian governments, describing them as having pleaded for trade access. He called the Canadian economy small, very small, entirely dependent on the United States. At one point, he turned to a member of his delegation and said loudly enough for the entire room to hear, "These people do not understand how much they have benefited." The Canadian delegation remained seated and listened. They took notes. A few exchanged glances. The senior Canadian trade negotiator later told colleagues that 10 minutes after the door had closed, he understood this was not a negotiation. It was a performance, and the primary audience was the Americans in the room. The objective was no longer agreement. The objective was dominance. The Canadian leader recognized this shift. He attempted calmly and with discipline to redirect the discussion back to substance. He returned to specific components of the proposal. He outlined genuine concessions on agricultural market access, concessions that, if announced, could have drawn attention in agricultural publications across the United States. He presented economic data showing that the proposed framework would benefit manufacturing workers. In competitive American states, they were attempting to offer Mr. Trump something that could be declared a victory grounded in substance, a victory that could stand before cameras. Trump did not engage. He leaned down and whispered to an aide. When the energy trade segment concluded, a proposal that could have saved American consumers billions of dollars over 5 years, he shifted to an entirely different subject. He complained about Canadian broadcasting regulations. Issues unrelated to the trade matters under discussion, unrelated to the specific proposals, and absent from any prepared policy priority. Two members of his own trade team exchanged glances across the table. According to sources, it reflected confusion and resignation. They had prepared for weeks for substantive counterproposals. None were used, none were requested, none were given consideration. And then, approximately 22 minutes into what had been scheduled as a 90-minute meeting, the moment arrived. Trump, displaying increasing impatience, stopped the conversation and made a demand described by sources on both sides as unprecedented in diplomatic negotiations. He slid a document across the table, a document the Canadian delegation had never seen, never transmitted through diplomatic channels, never discussed in advance. He asked the Canadian leader to sign immediately, with no time for review, no legal analysis, no consultation, no adherence to the basic procedures afforded to sovereign nations in negotiations worldwide. According to sources who reviewed the document, its terms were so one-sided that they exceeded what any Canadian government could accept. Some American officials present later described the document as structured to be rejected. One source close to the American delegation said, "This was not a proposal. It was a humiliation test. The objective was not to secure a signature. The objective was to have them sit there and be compelled to sign something that diminished them. Trump then leaned forward and looked directly at the Canadian leader. Sources on both sides confirmed the statement that followed: "You can sign now, or return home and explain to your people why you failed to reach agreement because you were too proud to do what needed to be done." Silence settled across the room. 5 seconds passed, then 10, then 15. Those present later described it as the longest silence of their careers. Everyone in the Roosevelt room understood that the next 30 seconds could shape the trajectory of the most important bilateral relationship in the Western world for the coming decade, and perhaps far beyond it. What deserves reflection here is not only what was said in that room, but what those sitting across the table clearly understood about the long-term consequences. The Canadian leader looked down at the document before him, then looked up with a composure that was difficult to ignore. Those present later said his voice carried more weight than any raised tone ever could. "Mr. President, we came to this meeting in good faith. We have spent many weeks preparing proposals designed to address your concerns with real and meaningful concessions." He continued without altering his cadence. "We came here to negotiate, which requires voluntary participation from both sides. What you have presented is not negotiation. It is an ultimatum intended to humiliate, and Canada does not accept ultimatums." Then a pause settled into the room. Not a pause of confusion, but a pause shaped by a decision already made. The Canadian leader closed the binder. That had remained open since the meeting began. Inside were weeks of preparation, 14 compromise frameworks, economic models, and supporting data. All of it was closed quietly, yet with unmistakable finality. He rose from his chair. The entire delegation stood with him. There was no haste, no anger, no theatrical gesture, only the controlled movement of people who understood their choice. They walked toward the door. No one on the American side attempted to stop them. No one spoke. At the threshold, the Canadian leader paused and said, "When you are ready for a real negotiation, you know how to reach us." They left the Roosevelt room, walked through the West Wing corridor, and exited the White House. 26 minutes, a meeting scheduled for 90 minutes, intended to reset the most important bilateral relationship in the Western world, ended in 26 minutes. After the door closed, silence filled the room. The unsigned document remained where it had been pushed. The Canadian binders were still neatly arranged across the table. The water glasses remained full. Physical evidence of a conversation that had never truly taken place. Displays of power depend upon the presence of an audience. When the audience leaves, the illusion leaves with it. According to sources, anger surfaced almost immediately. Who do they think they are? Those were said to be the first words spoken after the door shut. Some attempted to frame the walkout as a temporary setback, something that could be repaired with a phone call. Others understood that visible anger was expected and that opposing it might end a career. The Roosevelt room, with its diplomatic flags and presidential portraits, suddenly appeared less like a venue for international dialogue and more like the aftermath of something irreparably broken. Meanwhile, the Canadian delegation moved in silence. No one spoke until they had exited the building. Calls began before the motorcade cleared the White House driveway. The Canadian leader placed a call while en route to Joint Base Andrews. One call was made to the Canadian ambassador in Washington. The message consisted of 7 words. "It is over. Initiate contingency planning." A few hours later, I addressed what the market would soon recognize, not with emotion, but in the language of consequences. You cannot resolve a trade dispute by humiliating the other side in a room. You cannot negotiate by demanding submission. You cannot slide an unsigned document across a table and instruct a sovereign nation to sign without reading. When you conduct a meeting that way, you are creating an adversary, and America has just created one it cannot afford. In 6 decades of negotiations, I have never achieved a better outcome by insulting the person across the table. Not once. You can be firm, you can be resolute, you can bargain aggressively, but you must allow the other party to retain their dignity. The moment you make someone feel diminished, The moment you make them feel lesser, you have lost them, not only for that meeting, but for the broader relationship. People may forget positions. They may forget numbers. They may forget proposal details, but they do not forget how you made them feel. The Canadian delegation will not forget that feeling. Economically, the translation is straightforward. Canada entered that meeting prepared to offer substantive concessions. Agricultural market access, energy pricing terms, manufacturing frameworks, elements that could have produced measurable victories. For American workers and businesses, the proposals were ready. The concessions were prepared. Agreements could have been executed instead of leaving the room with tangible gains. The American side demanded complete surrender. And the result is this: no concessions, no relationship. The market, which had risen on expectations of an agreement, fell once news of the collapse emerged, and the decline moved below the prior baseline because hope had been created and then destroyed. The destruction of hope damages confidence more deeply than if hope had never been created. I lost more money that day than I would have if the meeting had never occurred. Hope, when misused, becomes a form of reverse leverage. People prepared for an agreement. The agreement did not merely fail, it fractured. That is the financial cost of diplomatic negligence. And what remains now is not only the numbers, but the precedent that has just been established, a precedent the market will over time assign its own valuation to. If a nation cannot complete a serious negotiation with its closest partner, what does that truly signal to the rest of the system? And how will the long-term cost of that signal be distributed over the years? Continuing from the point I made earlier, there is a word that fits what occurred in that room. It was negligence, diplomatic negligence. You had a partner willing to sit down. They were prepared to offer meaningful concessions. They brought forward tangible outcomes you could present to voters, markets, and factory workers. And all of it was lost because the real work of negotiation, listening, adjustment, concession, and construction, often satisfies the ego less than a display of dominance. Frankly, it may have been the most expensive display of ego in the history of United States trade policy. And when decisions of that kind are made, American workers inevitably bear the consequences for many years. Consequences operate according to their own mechanism, almost with the inevitability of an event many can foresee, except the one who set it in motion. Within hours of the meeting, the two sides were telling entirely different stories. Canada held a brief and measured press conference at its embassy in Washington. The tone was factual, restrained, and marked more by regret than anger. They said they came to Washington in good faith, bringing detailed proposals and meaningful concessions intended to address American concerns directly. They said the meeting did not proceed on a foundation of mutual respect and substantive negotiation as they had expected and as circumstances required. They stated they remained ready for genuine dialogue whenever the United States was prepared to engage, but would not accept ultimatums and would not participate in a performance. President Trump responded through Truth Social. Several posts asserted the meeting was highly effective and that Canada left because it knew it was losing badly and could not accept the truth about deceiving the American people. The contrast between the two accounts, one a cautious acknowledgement of failure, the other a declaration of victory, spoke clearly to the world. Diplomats do not walk away from effective meetings. Nations do not activate contingency plans after successful negotiations. Within 24 hours, detailed accounts began appearing across major media outlets on both sides of the border. It is worth noting that the leaks did not come solely from the Canadian side. They also came from American officials present in the room. Anonymous quotations from members of President Trump's own delegation described the meeting in sobering terms. One said it should have been a reset, but was turned into a hostage situation. Another said the Canadians brought serious proposals, yet not a single page was reviewed. A negotiator with 15 years of trade experience said he had never felt so embarrassed in such a room. When signals like that emerge from both sides, the market aggregates them. And this time, the response bordered on despair. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell sharply. Industrial stocks declined steeply. Energy companies dependent on Canadian supply chains lost billions of dollars in market capitalization. Before the meeting, many business leaders had paused contingency plans in hope of an agreement. Afterward, they moved quickly to reactivate them. Exploratory supply chain restructuring efforts became far more determined. Investment in alternative Canadian infrastructure, from Pacific-facing pipelines to Atlantic port capacity, along with trade diversification agreements with the European Union and Asia, received a distinct acceleration. The meeting did not merely fail to resolve the issue. It accelerated separation. Companies and investors reached a sober conclusion that if the United States could not reach agreement with Canada, its closest and most willing partner, then agreements with more complex partners would be even less likely. And once that conclusion forms, long-term decisions begin to follow, not driven by the emotion of a single day, but by an assessment of structural risk over years. The international signal carried weight as well. European allies expressed deep frustration. Questions were raised quietly yet seriously, that if the United States could not sustain an effective 90-minute meeting with Canada, how could other nations expect substantive negotiations? Some officials within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization privately questioned whether the alliance's most powerful member still possessed the basic diplomatic capacity required to maintain security structures upon which millions rely. The German Foreign Office called for restraint and a return to constructive dialogue. Diplomatic language of that kind is usually understood in a very specific way. Japan and South Korea, each managing their own complex trade relationships with Washington, quietly instructed their teams to study the meeting in the Roosevelt Room as a case study for future situations. And when partners begin adjusting their behavior in that direction, we are no longer discussing a single incident. We are observing a gradual repricing of trust, step by step over time. And if we step back just a little further, a broader question comes into view. When a strategic rival watches you weaken your own alliance network, what will they do with that opportunity over time? Soon after the meeting, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China invited Canada to expand trade discussions at any time convenient for what it called our Canadian friends. The satisfaction beneath that phrasing was not difficult to detect. A rival observing its principal competitors strain its own alliances from within. Every adversary of the United States gained advantage from that failed meeting. And every ally registered a corresponding decline in confidence. 26 minutes in the Roosevelt Room accomplished what decades of external pressure had not. It caused America's closest friends to question whether friendship still justified the strategic cost. Then there was the call placed from the car: initiate the contingency plan. Those 7 words triggered precisely what the meeting was meant to prevent: the full activation of Canada's economic diversification and independence strategy. Accelerated pipeline projects moved forward with greater urgency. Mineral exports were reassessed. Trade agreements with the European Union, with Pacific Rim nations, with the United Kingdom, and with India were expanded. The meeting was designed to pull both countries back from the edge. Instead, it moved Canada beyond that edge, not into crises, but into structured transformation. 26 minutes intended to preserve a relationship became the catalyst for replacing it. There is a principle found in every serious negotiation manual ever written. The objective of any meeting is not merely the terms on paper. The objective is that the other side leaves feeling heard, respected, and treated as an equal, even when the provisions are difficult and the demands firm. Not because of sentiment, not because of courtesy, but because of calculation. A partner who feels respected is inclined to concede. A partner who feels heard is inclined to compromise. A partner who feels humiliated builds defenses, and over time builds adversaries. That is among the oldest rules in human commerce. It predates modern diplomacy by thousands of years, and it was violated in the most consequential room of the most powerful building in the world. Can the relationship recover from what occurred in that room? The honest answer is not quickly, and perhaps not completely, because this was not a dispute over tariffs or technical clauses. This was a fracture of trust, the most personal and most difficult form of breakdown between parties required to cooperate across many domains. In 26 minutes, the Canadian delegation reached a conclusion. They determined that the United States was not genuinely seeking negotiation, was not fully respecting Canadian sovereignty, and did not intend to treat Canada as an equal partner. Lessons learned in a private, face-to-face room do not fade easily. They do not soften simply because time passes. They shape how every subsequent meeting is approached, every future proposal, every handshake, every telephone call, every diplomatic exchange. Goodwill once fully betrayed does not return in the same form. The meeting lasted 26 minutes. It was scheduled for 90 minutes. The Canadian delegation had prepared for weeks. They flew to Washington carrying binders filled with proposals, economic models, 14 distinct compromise frameworks, and carefully constructed goodwill from a nation seeking resolution. They brought seriousness, they brought preparation, they brought respect for the process and for those across the table. And within 26 minutes, they concluded that the other side was not seeking resolution. It was seeking submission. It was seeking a video. It was seeking the image of dominance rather than the substance of agreement. When that performance was declined, when the Canadian leader closed the binder and departed with the quiet composure of someone unwilling to be humiliated, the room was left with silence, unsigned documents, and untouched glasses of water. I described it as diplomatic misjudgment, perhaps the costliest display of ego in United States trade policy. Markets viewed it as a disaster. Allies regarded it as a turning point. The Canadian delegation will likely remember it as the last time they entered a room with that level of trust. 26 minutes, scheduled for 90 minutes. 26 minutes were sufficient to erode 75 years of goodwill. In less time than a luncheon, the contingency plan was activated. Diversification began to accelerate. The relationship meant to be repaired in that room began to be replaced by alternative structures. And those 26 minutes, over time, may be studied in diplomatic circles as an illustration of how a critical alliance can be weakened faster than a cup of coffee cools.